Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in this talk, we're going to talk on the English Nonconformists. The king who was after King James I of England was his son, Charles I, and he ascended to the throne in 1625. However, Charles I was executed, and England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell. The monarchy was restored in 1660 when Charles I's son, who was Charles II, was invited back to take the throne. In 1662, there was a law that was passed in Britain called the Act of Uniformity. This law mandated conformity to the Church of England's revised Book of Common Prayer for all clergy and officials. Approximately 2,500 ministers refused to subscribe to the declaration of unfeigned assent to everything in the prayer book. Because these ministers were non-conforming to this law that had just been adopted by Parliament, they lost their positions and the support that went with the churches that they served. The prayer book dictated how the worship, sacraments, and ceremonies were to be done. The purpose of this law was to produce religious uniformity, but this act actually deepened divisions within England. The result was increased persecution of dissenting groups for over a century. In 1664, there was another act that was passed in English law called the Conventicular Act, and it prohibited religious assemblies of more than 5 people outside of a single household that did not follow the rites of the Church of England. Protestant nonconformists were given penalties, including fines, imprisonment, and even removal from the country for repeat offenses. Now, for the first offense, you could have up to 3 months in prison. The second offense was up to 6 months in prison. And the third offense was transportation for 7 years. The nonconformists were tried by 2 justices of the peace or a chief magistrate without a jury. The next year, in 1665, there was a 5-mile act that prohibited an unauthorized minister to live within 5 miles of any town or parish where they had previously preached. The offenders faced fines or imprisonment. Here we can see what happens when the government becomes a government of church and state. Thousands of ministers were driven out and imprisoned for their refusal to conform. It was during this time that a great nonconformist or free church movement arose that protested against a state-prescribed religion. These acts were suspended in 1687, but until that time, there were many godly families that experienced the intervening power of God. Edward Calamy was one of these ejected nonconformist ministers, and he wrote a book called Nonconformist Memorial, which tells of some of the special providences that happened during this time. One story is of a Scottish minister named Henry Erskine, and he was finally driven out of Scotland and then out of England. One day Henry was walking the streets of Scotland's capital in Edinburgh, where he was in great need and distress. A stranger, dressed as a countryman, came up to him with a letter that had money in it. Henry never found out who this benefactor was. It could have been an angel of God. Another time, when Henry was in financial need, He was walking through a marshy ground and heard something tinkle at the end of his walking stick. When he stooped down to look at it, he found that it had 2 half-crowns. Henry and his family were often in great straits. One time, their cruse of oil and barrel of meal was gone, and they had no food or money in the house. In the morning, the young children cried for their breakfast, and Henry prayed to God, who feeds the young ravens when they cry for food. While still praying, Henry heard a knock on the door. A countryman stood outside the door and said that he was sent with provisions for him and his family. When they opened the sack, they found that it was well filled with the food that they needed. Another nonconformist minister was Matthew Warren, a scholar from Oxford. Being silenced as a minister, Matthew devoted himself to the educating of the youth of the ministry. One day, Matthew's wife had a strange impression upon her mind that her husband needed to remove himself from the home that he was presently visiting. She felt that if he did not remove himself, that he would be taken as a prisoner. She sent a messenger to her husband with a letter that earnestly begged him to come home by such time, or else he might never see her any more. Matthew thought that his wife must be very sick and left the home that he was visiting, not knowing that his danger was the cause of the urgency. He immediately said goodbye to his friends and headed homeward. He was not far from his friend's house when he happened to look back and saw that it was surrounded by persons that were sent to search for him. Another Oxford scholar, who was a nonconformist minister, was John Noffworthy. He was driven out and hunted. Once, when he and his family had had breakfast, they realized that they had nothing left for another meal. John's wife was depressed in spirits and wondered what they were going to do for their poor children. John convinced his wife to go for a walk with him, and on their walk they saw a little bird. John told his wife, "Take notice how that little bird sits and chirps, though we cannot tell whether it has had breakfast, and if it has, it knows not whither to go for dinner. Therefore, be of good cheer, and do not distrust the providence of God, for are we not better than many sparrows?" End of quote. So the preacher's faith, it was rewarded, because before the time of dinner came, provisions had been sent them from an unknown source. One of the most eminent of the early English dissenters was a man by the name of Hansard Nolly. He had fled for a time from England to escape imprisonment. He was still under the ban of the authorities when he returned to England. Hansard said, "I was still poor and sojourned in a lodging till I had but 6 pence left, and knew not how to provide for my wife and child. Having prayed to God and encouraged my wife to trust in Him, to remember former experiences and that word of promise, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, I paid for my lodging and went out, not knowing whither God's good hand would lead me to receive something towards my present substance. About 7 or 8 doors from my lodgings, a woman met me in the street and told me she came to seek me, and her husband had sent her to tell me that there was a lodging provided and prepared at his house by some Christian friends for me and my wife. I told her of my present condition and went along with her to the house. There she gave me 20 shillings, which Dr. Bostock, a late sufferer, had given her for me, and some linen for my wife, which I received, and told her husband I would fetch my wife and child and lodge there. I returned with great joy, and my wife was greatly affected with this seasonable and suitable supply. After we had returned praises to God, we went to our new lodgings, where we found all things necessarily provided for us, and all charges paid for 15 weeks. End quote. It was in London that Hansard embraced the principles of the Baptists. Through the years, he suffered many imprisonments and much persecution as one of the hated Anabaptists who stood alone for full religious liberty. In the end, he was forced to flee to Holland and Germany for refuge. But he was protected and spared to an old age as a loyal minister of Christ during troublous times. In 1662, the Nonconformist minister, Mr. Rogers, was expelled from his church. He had been living near a persecuting magistrate, and his name was Sir Richard Cradock. Now, Sir Cradock was very bitter against the Nonconformist dissenters. He had set spies to watch Mr. Rogers, and was delighted when he was able to summon him for preaching at a place nearby. Mr. Rogers, as well as several of his friends who attended this illegal service, were condemned to prison. The magistrate, Sir Cradock, was in another room making out the papers. Cradock had a granddaughter, which was willful and spoiled. The little girl hated to be restrained and had once injured herself with a knife when disciplined. Cradock was afraid that his granddaughter would do something desperate if she was not given her way, and he had actually given orders to the household that the girl should be given her way in everything. Mr. Rogers, living near to the magistrate, had been friendly with the magistrate's little granddaughter, and the little girl thought of Mr. Rogers as her friend. When the granddaughter discovered that her friend, Mr. Rogers, was to be sent to prison by her grandfather, she had a temper tantrum. She ran to the chamber where her grandfather was and beat the door with her heels, fists, and even her head until the door opened. When the door opened, she demanded, "What are you going to do with my friend here in the hall?" That's nothing to you," said the grandfather. "Get you about your business." "I will not," she said. "He tells me that you are going to send him and his friends to jail, and if you do, I will drown myself in the pond as soon as they are gone. I will indeed," she said. Sir Cradock saw that the child was determined and didn't know what to do. Finally, he stepped into the hall with the written order for arrest in his hand. He told Mr. Rogers, "I have here made out your arrest to send you all to jail, but at my granddaughter's request, I will set you at liberty." End quote. So Mr. Rogers and his friends, they all bowed and they thanked the magistrate. Mr. Rogers walked over to the granddaughter and laid his hand on her head, and lifting up his eyes to heaven, he said, God bless you, my dear child. May the blessings of that God, whose cause you now plead, though as yet you do not know him, be upon you in life and at death and throughout eternity. End quote. Years later, when Mr. Rogers had already passed, his son, who was Timothy Rogers, was visiting a wealthy lady in London, and her name was Mrs. Tooley. The lady was famous for her hospitality for religious workers. As they talked together, Timothy, he told the story of his father's deliverance. Mrs. Tooley listened with great interest and then asked if Timothy was Mr. Rogers' son. Yes, madame, he answered. Then Mrs. Tooley told Timothy that she was the girl from the story that his father had blessed. She said that Mr. Rogers' prayer had made an impression upon her and that she could never forget it. Mrs. Tooley had inherited her grandfather's estate, and as a young girl had followed all of the fashionable vanities of the world. However, she had not found any satisfaction in it. While in the west of England, in the town of Bath, she visited the springs for her health. There, a doctor got her to promise to read the New Testament and said that it would help her with her health. However, reading the Bible made her even more uneasy. She returned to London, but then one night she had a dream about being in a place of worship. She was so impressed with the dream that she told her lady companion that she was going to search for a church that she had seen in a dream. The next Sunday, she searched for the church that she saw in her dream. After some time, they came to a narrow lane and saw a throng of people going to a church. She mixed herself among them and followed them into the meeting house. As she entered through the door, she told the companion, "This is the very place I saw in my dream." When the minister got up to speak in the pulpit, she said again, "This is the very man that I saw in my dream, and he will take for his text, 'Return unto thy rest, O my soul.'" End quote. This was sure enough the very passage that the pastor used. Mrs. Tooley said that it was there that God met her in a saving manner, and since then she had gained what she had sought for in vain elsewhere, rest in Christ for her troubled soul. Now there are still some more deliverance stories from the Nonconformist ministers in England that I would like to share with you, but we're going to have to do that in our next talk, in part 2. I hope that you are enjoying this history. I want to thank each one of you for listening. And if you are enjoying these talks, I would just encourage you to click on that subscribe button. And I'm wishing God's blessings to each one of you.